Big thank you to Simply Safe for sponsoring today's video. I'll tell you about them later on. Man, it is crazy how fast time flies. It was 5 years ago that I started making YouTube videos showing people how I was building things. And one of those things was a dog food dispenser. It was just a simple shape, and at the bottom I placed a blast gate to release food into a pouring container. It worked great, but there was no way to regulate how much dog food was being dispensed. Well, in this video, I will show you how I remade the dispenser with a mechanism inside that releases a set amount of food per pull of a lever. Pretty cool, huh? Let me start at the beginning and show you how I did it. Okay, let's start with making the body. I kept the overall shape of it the same as before because honestly the shape is the best for the application, I think. But this time I wanted to soften the shape some by adding in some curves. Instead of messing around with bending wood, I cut out a template on my CNC, then traced it onto a sheet of plywood, and then cut it out. What I'm doing is I'm building up the sides to the height needed by stacking identical parts on top of each other. I'm using Titebond's fast drying thick and quick here, and also using a brad nailer to hold the parts to the previous one. For the body I'm using a construction grade plywood because I'll be painting mine later on. If you would rather stain yours, then you can do the same process from any solid wood as well. But once the glue was dry, I gave both sides a good sanding with 80 grit to smooth out any slight unevenness between the layers. If you use plywood, unless you use a really high-end grade, there's always going to be a few voids in the plies. My method for filling these in for a seamless paint surface is to apply some joint compound to it. Once the compound is fully dry, I again sanded it, but with this time with 120 grit. Alright, for the moment that is the body done, so let's start working on the mechanism. My little dogs eat 1 cup of food each day, so I started off building a mechanism that would dispense that amount. I grabbed some PVC pipe and cut 2 lengths at the miter saw. This is what will store the needed amount of food. Next I grabbed some 1/2-inch scraps and started making a few circles. I used a compass to draw the circle, a bandsaw to cut them out, then a Forstner bit to cut out the smaller needed circles. If you don't have a Forstner bit, you can instead use a drill to punch a through hole large enough to get a jigsaw blade into. Then you can use a jigsaw to cut it out. This whole assembly creates the inside portion that holds the food and also rotates about when the lever is pulled. Now to make the top and bottom parts that will open and close off the holes and stay stationary while the inside moves. I'm again using scraps to make these parts and started off cutting a few rectangles over at the table saw. Then I clamped them to my armor tool table once again and punched a few holes. In one of the plates, after the 2 holes were cut out, I used a jigsaw to cut a curved pathway between the 2. This simple cutout drastically cuts down on the food getting stuck and crunched when moving the lever and cutting off the flow of food. After drilling yet another circle on what will be the bottom, where the food drops out from, I piled all the parts on top of each other and drilled a center hole. I started with the top assembly, which has a circle cut out and 2 square pieces being held together with a carriage bolt and 2 nuts to lock it into place. Also in this assembly is something to aggregate the food, which in my case is a paint stirrer stick cut to length. This part will knock the food around when moving the lever to keep it flowing nicely into the pipes below. Next I flipped it over and started assembling the bottom, first attaching the circle with 2 cutouts. Oh, and I again used Titebond's Thick and Quick to glue the PVC pipes to the wood. This is an interior multi-surface glue, so it's perfect for sticking different material together quickly. Then lastly, I threw on the bottom rectangle where the food drops out of and tightened everything down. Alright, now let me see if I can show you how it works. When I attach the lever, I will be able to rotate the inside circles to one side, which opens up one of the pipes while closing the other. This is the top, so one will always be filling while the other one will be closed. Then on the other side, which will be the bottom, there's only 1 hole. And one pipe will always be emptying while the other one is closed off. This closed off pipe is the one filling. In theory, you can resize the device to hold any amount of dog food, cat food, cereal, coffee beans, really anything you can think of. But keep in mind, the larger in diameter you go with those pipes, the larger the dispenser will be overall. After putting this one together, I actually downsized mine because while my dogs eat 1 cup of food daily, they eat it over 2 meals throughout the day. So next I made it a device to dispense just half a cup of food at one time. And just going from a full cup to half a cup, you can see the size difference that it makes in the device, which, like I said, will determine how big the body needs to be. Before setting that aside to build the front, the last thing I did was stick a handle on it. I made a simple shape, then again used some Tite Bond to attach it to the device itself. Okay, and now onto the face. Remember that this can be as simple as a plywood sheet, but I thought it would be really cool to do a 2-piece live edge with some epoxy down the middle that could be used as a sight glass to see the level of dog food inside. Even cooler, I'm using a piece of mesquite I personally milled up myself a year ago with my chainsaw mill. It just so happened to be the perfect height for this project and was actually wide enough to use as well. But I thought it would make a much cooler piece if I cut it down the middle, resawed it to book match, and point the 2 live edge portions towards one another. I used my track saw to rip down the center, but even doing this, it exceeded the cut capacity of my bandsaw to resaw it. So I took it to my neighbor's shop and used his to get 2 boards that are about 3/8 of an inch thick. I quickly ran each one over the jointer to get one side flat, and then through my thickness planer to get the second side flat. Real quick, I want to pause and say a big thank you to this video sponsor, which is Simply Safe. If you've been following along, you know that I've been using Simply Safe as my shop security for a while now. It is incredibly effective, reliable home or shop security that will make sure your property is safe at a price of only 50 cents a day. I can relax knowing my shop and my tools are professionally monitored 24/7, and if anything happens, they'll make sure the police are called. Simply Safe's system is modern, comprehensive, and protects your property inside and out. Their professional monitoring has 3.5 times faster police dispatch by security specialists who provide real eyewitness evidence to the police department. Recently, I decided to take my shop security one step further and add the Simply Safe lock. I can grant access remotely if necessary, and I can even set up unique access codes so I can get alerted as to exactly who is locking and unlocking the door. Simply Safe's reliable, comprehensive coverage at a value is one of the reasons experts call it the #1 recommended home security. Right now, Simply Safe is having the biggest sale of the season. Protect your home and family this holiday season with Simply Safe. But hurry, because the offer ends Cyber Monday. If you'd like to learn more about Simply Safe, you can click the link down in the description. Next, I set up a station to do my epoxy pour. First, figuring out how my boards were going to lay and how far apart they needed to be. Next, I laid down tape to cover up the bottom of the board. And the intention here is to create a surface that the epoxy won't be able to stick to. However, I will tell you that this painter's tape ended up sticking really bad. I hear house wrap tape releases much better, but I didn't have any of that on hand. After the tape, I cut a few scraps to length to create some walls. These will build a form around my 2 mesquite boards to keep the epoxy in. I again used tape on the bottom edges of these boards since they will be the portion in contact with the epoxy. Next, I attached the boards and sealed around it to prevent the epoxy from leaking out while it dries. I've seen people use silicone before, but that has a really long dry time, and I was trying to get the pour done that day. So I used a fast-setting adhesive from Tite Bond called Tight Grab. I laid down a decent bead under the side walls and then mushed them down on top. It is an adhesive, so this will attach the walls to the bottom. And then I just took the squeeze out and used it to seal off where the bottom meets the walls and the corners where the walls meet each other. With the form done, next I set my boards in place, then started to mix together the epoxy. Since my goal is to use this as a sight glass, it's really important to use an epoxy that would end up crystal clear. And this brand, Total Boat, has always amazed me on how clear it comes out. So that is what I used. Also, if you're needing epoxy, remember that you can use the code APRILW to get 20% off anything Total Boat. Okay, and time to pour. I was a little bit nervous because this was my first big-ish epoxy pour, but honestly, there was no reason to be. I poured it right down the center until it filled up to the surface, then waited a little bit for it to settle, and then kept pouring in more. You'll see that there are lots of bug holes in the sapwood of this mesquite. I didn't want these to get filled in because I think they look cool as little tunnels. Once you're done pouring, you can use a quick amount of flame to pop all of the air bubbles in the epoxy. Then I recommend checking to make sure your form isn't leaking, and then just let it sit until cured. The next day I used a mallet to bust open the form and expose the pore. The sides did come off easily enough, but that tape, nuh-uh. That was stuck pretty darn good. Instead of spending the time it would take to peel it off, I ended up sanding it off, which isn't a big problem since the next step was to sand the front and clean up all of the excess epoxy. For this job, I started with 80 grit and I used the more aggressive setting on my 6-inch Triton ROS. And this made quick work of the epoxy and the tape. I use my RRS to go through the grits I have pads for, which I only keep up to 320 in my shop. So then I switched over to hand sanding and continued to 500, 800, 1000, 1500, and then 3000. The goal is to remove all of the scratches you made from the previous grit. And after getting through 3000, the last step to really make it shine is to add some polish compound and buff it. You can do this a few different ways, but I have a grinding wheel that has a buffing wheel on one side. So that's what I use to polish up the epoxy. This was kind of hard to do because it's side and it's middle placement, but I made it work on both the front and back. Wow, that definitely makes a difference. Okay, now that's 3 components done. The body, the mechanism, and the front. So now we can join them together. The front is really the main part that will be seen because my dispenser will end up in my kitchen pantry. So I picked out a brown that would complement the mesquite wood. Then for the mechanism, I painted it whatever sort of brown I had in a rattle can. I honestly didn't think too much about it because you really can't see it as the sight glass narrows where it is. After attaching the body to the dispenser, I set it on a piece of ply to trace out for it back. I quickly zipped that out and then attached it using Thick and Quick once again. For a lid, I cut a piece of piano hinge to size and threw it on using a few short screws. Before attaching the top, I first squared up the top edge over at the table saw using a crosscut sled. Once I had that edge sorted, I measured down in 2 different places to the final length I needed the piece. And this way I could use a track saw to cut it square. Okay, so that works. So far so good. Next I used the table saw to rip off another small strip of the epoxy pour to attach it right underneath the handle. After squaring both pieces up to the body and also making sure they were in line with each other, I used the smallest drill bit I owned to punch through the front face and into the body. My intention is to attach this face by using dowels, but I don't want to see them on the front at all. And I'm calling them blind dowels, but I really don't know if that's a real term or not. After punching a few holes through the face and into the body, now I could remove the top and have an exact location in both pieces to enlarge that would fit a dowel. I used a piece of tape on my drill bit to mark a depth and make sure I wouldn't go through the face. I threw some Type-On and some 1/4-inch dowels in the holes, then crossed my fingers and hoped this method worked. Oh, I love it when things fit. Ah! I didn't want to use a brad nailer on the face, so I threw it in clamps until this glue was dried. But then I used my favorite bit, which is that Infinity Mega Flush Trim bit, to match the shape of the body to the front. I also used the Infinity Round Over bit after to soften it a tad by getting rid of those hard 90-degree edges. Then I ran over the entire front with 220 grit paper. Alright, and now on to finish. This is my first time working with mesquite, but what a beautiful, beautiful wood. Not only the red brownish of that heartwood, but also that brilliant yellow sapwood. I also love that the majority of the bug holes stayed hollow. After letting 3 coats dry, I hung it up. Now this will end up in my kitchen pantry, but since I can't easily get a camera in there, I hung it on my shop wall to show you how it works. Dog food will go in at the top. Then whenever I pull the lever, a set amount will dispense from the bottom. Of course, whenever I'm serving the dogs, I will place their food bowls under the dispenser. But for testing purposes, I was using a measuring cup. So, what do y'all think? I honestly wasn't too sure about that live edge front when I started, but I am really loving the way that it came out. I think the sight glass is neat, and I love being able to just pull a lever and the right amount of food fall into the bowl. I hope that you enjoyed this project. I hope that you learned something, and I will see you on my next project.